Okay, so are you ready for this?
I think so. Hit me.
Today, we're diving headfirst into Trump's second term as president.
Oh, wow. Okay, this is going to be interesting.
I know, right?
Yeah.
We've got a mountain of sources here: policy papers, news articles, you name it.
Social media, too.
Oh, absolutely. Even some snippets from interviews, politicians, sheriffs,
Okay, so we're talking the whole shebang.
the whole shebang.
All right, I'm intrigued. What have we got? What's the big picture?
Well, one thing that jumps out is this weird mix of reactions.
Mixed reactions, Sal.
Right off the bat, the stock market's booming, businesses are celebrating, but at the same time,
At the same time.
cabinet nominees are getting bomb threats over Thanksgiving.
Oh, wow. That's, intense.
Intense is putting it mildly.
Yeah. Talk about a mixed bag, huh?
Total mixed bag. So before we even get into the policies, those slogans Trump used, America First, restoring American greatness.
What do they actually mean in terms of real-world stuff?
Yeah, those slogans, they're catchy, but, well,
How do those translate into actual policy?
exactly. Like, what would those bumper stickers look like in action?
Right.
So let's unpack this.
Okay, let's do it.
America First. That one seems pretty straightforward, right? Putting American interests first. But what does that really look like?
Well, it's like a whole package deal, right?
Okay, break it down for me.
Trade deals that benefit the U.S., a super tough stance on immigration, and like this overall idea that America's calling the shots on the world stage. In fact, the GOP platform straight up says, if we don't have a border, we don't have a country.
Whoa. Okay, so no mincing words there.
Nope.
All right, so that's America First. What about restoring American greatness? A lot of people seem to really connect with that.
Yeah, it's powerful stuff. It taps into this idea that America was once this unstoppable force.
Economically, militarily.
Exactly, and that's lost its way. So restoring American greatness is like bringing back manufacturing jobs, becoming energy independent, basically going back to this like golden age of prosperity and strength. In the source material, Trump even says, "We are going to keep our promise. Nothing will stop me from keeping my word to you, the people."
It's like a promise to turn back time, huh?
Yeah, pretty much.
But didn't that greatness come at a cost for some people? Like for minorities, for example?
That's a good point. And the sources do mention concerns about the impact on certain groups, especially when it comes to immigration and law enforcement. But the focus from the GOP side is very much on the benefits for the average American. Like if the country as a whole is doing better, everyone benefits.
Hmm. So a rising tide lifts all boats.
Yeah, that's the general idea.
Okay, so what about common sense? That one almost seems too vague. Right?
Yeah, I know, right? But that's kind of the point.
How so?
They're presenting it as the opposite of all these fancy, complicated policies that don't work.
So less talk, more action.
Yeah, and less bureaucracy, more practical solutions. They see it as cutting through the red tape and focusing on what really matters to everyday people.
Okay, so left political correctness, more practicality. And that seems to go hand in hand with law and order, which I imagine translates to some pretty strong policies, right?
Absolutely. Law and order is basically code for cracking down on crime and illegal immigration. We're talking increased border security, mass deportations. The sources even call it the largest deportation operation in American history.
Wow, okay. And they're also talking about a much closer relationship between federal agencies like ICE and local law enforcement, even potentially overriding those sanctuary city policies.
Yeah, it seems like they're really serious about taking a hard line.
Extreme vetting and bypassing sanctuary cities, those are some loaded terms. Can you explain what those actually mean?
Sure. Extreme vetting means basically making the screening process for anyone entering the country way more intense, especially if they're from places the government considers high risk. Think more background checks, interviews, even looking at people's social media.
Whoa, so they're leaving no stone unturned.
Pretty much.
Right.
And as for sanctuary cities, those are places that limit how much they cooperate with federal immigration enforcement. It's meant to protect undocumented immigrants who haven't committed serious crimes. But based on these sources, Trump wants to find ways around that.
So a much tougher approach all around. And it looks like people like Sheriff Gawler are fully on board with that, especially when it comes to deportations. But I'm curious, what happens to the people who are deported? Where do they go?
That's the thing. The sources don't give us a clear answer on that. It's like this big question mark. A lot of countries might just refuse to take them back.
Oh, wow. That's a problem.
Yeah, it could lead to a huge backlog of people stuck here in the U.S., putting a strain on resources and creating a real humanitarian crisis.
So lots of potential unintended consequences.
Definitely.
Okay, let's shift gears for a second and talk about the economy. The sources talk about this wave of optimism from businesses after the election, and they're pointing to Trump's economic agenda as the reason. What exactly is driving this optimism? Is it just tax cuts, or is there something more to it?
It's definitely more than just tax cuts. Remember those themes we talked about before? America First and restoring American greatness?
Right.
They're at the heart of his economic plan, too. Tackling inflation, getting manufacturing going again in the U.S., achieving energy independence. In the GOP platform, there's even this line that says, President Trump's economic policy to end inflation and return manufacturing jobs is not only what the American economy and American workers need right now, it is also what they want right now.
Hmm.
It's all about putting American businesses and workers first, being less reliant on other countries, and projecting this image of economic power on the world stage.
Okay, that makes sense. But how do those ideas translate into concrete actions? Like, what's the game plan here?
So when it comes to inflation, they're focusing on producing more goods here in the U.S.
To ease the strain on supply chains.
Exactly. And to be less dependent on imports, which can be affected by things happening in other countries.
Hmm.
Plus, they want to control government spending to avoid making inflation worse. And then there's energy independence. They're all about maximizing domestic energy production. That whole drill, baby, drill thing.
Right, I remember that.
The idea is to shield Americans from all the ups and downs of the global energy market and lower energy costs.
Which would have a ripple effect on the entire economy, right?
Exactly. And then you've got tax cuts, which are mainly focused on helping the middle class and encouraging businesses to create more jobs. The idea is that this will stimulate economic growth.
So a multi-pronged approach. But one thing that really stands out to me is this projection that the national debt is going to reach a whopping 185% of GDP by 2032. That's a huge EE number. How does that fit in with all this talk about economic growth and prosperity?
Yeah, that's a huge GE question mark. The sources kind of dance around it, to be honest.
So no easy answers there.
Nope. Some people argue that the economic growth from Trump's policies will eventually outweigh the costs, and the debt will start to shrink relative to the size of the economy. But others are like, hold on a second. Those proposed cuts to social programs and government agencies, are they really going to be enough to balance out all the extra spending on things like defense and border security? It's a gamble, that's for sure.
A gamble with some serious potential consequences.
Definitely.
But amidst all this talk of spending and cuts, there's also this push for what they're calling government reform, specifically cutting waste. I remember reading about Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy meeting with Republican lawmakers. What was that about?
That's where things get really interesting. It seems like Musk and Ramaswamy are being brought in as these efficiency experts. Their job is to figure out how to streamline the government and eliminate all the unnecessary spending.
So basically applying a business mindset to government.
Exactly. Finding all the redundancies, cutting the bureaucratic bloat. They think they can save trillions of dollars by doing this and by undoing some of Biden's policies.
Trillions. That sounds kind of hard to believe. I mean, government bureaucracy is notoriously difficult to change, right?
Yeah, the sources acknowledge that it's a huge undertaking.
Yeah.
And there's no guarantee they'll be successful. I mean, everyone loves the idea of less waste, right?
Sure, in theory.
But when you start talking about specific cuts, well, that's when things get complicated.
You've got all these powerful interest groups, lobbyists, people who benefit from the current system.
Exactly. They're not going to give up their piece of the pie without a fight.
So even if they do manage to pinpoint where to cut, I bet actually making those changes will be a whole other battle.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about programs and policies that impact millions of people. So any big cuts are going to trigger some major political fights. The sources actually talk about this potential for gridlock and partisan bickering, especially when it comes to things like student loan forgiveness or expanding healthcare, which are really popular with certain voters.
Yeah, those are hot button issues for sure.
Definitely. So even if Trump has a lot of support from voters, it's not going to be easy to push through those kind of reforms.
It sounds like a recipe for some serious political drama.
Oh, yeah. And speaking of potential roadblocks, the sources also mentioned some criticism of how Vice President Harris has been communicating since the election, particularly that video message she put out to supporters.
Right, I remember that. What are people saying about it?
The main critique is that it lacks substance and just didn't feel authentic. Democrats are saying it was too vague, full of empty calls to action, without actually addressing the issues or explaining why they lost the election.
So, like, they're trying to rally the troops without admitting defeat or offering a clear plan.
Yeah, exactly. And there were also some complaints about Harris not appearing on certain podcasts, like Joe Rogan's.
Oh, right. So while Trump was out there doing these long, unscripted interviews, Harris was sticking to the more traditional media outlets.
It seems that way. And some people think that was a mistake. The sources talk about this contrast between Harris's approach and Trump's, and how Trump's willingness to engage in those less formal settings might have helped him connect with more people, especially younger voters.
So in this day and age, it's not just about what you say, it's also about where you say it.
Exactly. And it seems like the Republicans are getting that. They're really good at using these alternative media platforms to reach people who might not be paying attention to traditional news.
That's a good point. But thinking bigger picture, this also says something about how political discourse is changing, right? Like, are we headed towards a world where politicians are judged more on their podcasting skills than on their policies?
That's an interesting question, one that the sources don't really delve into, but it's something to think about. With social media and all these alternative news sources, we're getting our information from so many different places now. It's a much more fragmented landscape, and it's not clear what that means for our democracy in the long run.
It's a double-edged sword, isn't it?
For sure. On the one hand, these platforms give ordinary people a voice and allow them to bypass the traditional gatekeepers. But on the other hand, they can also create these echo chambers where people only hear what they want to hear, and it becomes really difficult to have productive conversations across ideological lines.
It's like we're all living in our own little bubbles.
In a way, yeah.
Okay, so let's circle back to Trump's agenda. We've talked a lot about the impact here in the U.S., but what about the rest of the world? The sources mention Trump using tariffs as a bargaining chip with Mexico and Canada. Is that something we're likely to see more of in his second term?
It looks that way. The sources suggest that Trump threatened to hit Mexico with tariffs unless they did more to stop people from migrating to the U.S. border. And then, not long after, the Mexican president posted on social media that migrants and caravans are taken care of before they reach the border.
Wow, so it sounds like the threat worked.
It's hard to say for sure if that's the only reason, but it definitely looks like part of Trump's strategy, using economic pressure to get what he wants on the world stage.
That's a bold move, but also a risky one, right? I mean, couldn't that backfire and hurt our relationships with key allies?
That's the debate, isn't it? Some people think tariffs are a legitimate way to protect American interests and make other countries play fair. But others, like President Biden, have said that it's counterproductive and that it actually hurts American businesses and consumers. The sources present both sides of the argument.
So it's a complex issue with no easy answers.
Exactly. And speaking of complex issues, one thing that really jumped out at me was the mention of Canada increasing security on their southern border. That's not something you hear every day.
Right. You usually hear about the U.S.-Mexico border, not the U.S.-Canada border. Why are they doing that?
It seems like they're worried about a potential surge of people heading north if the U.S. tightens its own border control.
So they're basically preparing for a potential spillover effect from Trump's policies.
Yeah, it seems that way. The sources say they're investing in more drones, helicopters, more staff. They're basically beefing up their border security to try and stay ahead of the curve.
Wow. That's pretty significant. It really shows how interconnected these issues are, how what happens in one country can have ripple effects all over the place. But beyond just the security concerns, this could also put a strain on the relationship between the U.S. and Canada, right?
Definitely. It puts Canada in a tough spot.
Yeah.
They want to cooperate with the U.S. on border security, but they also need to protect their own interests and sovereignty. The sources hinted some tension there, and it could lead to some diplomatic challenges down the road.
It sounds like we're heading into a pretty unpredictable period. Here in the U.S., we've got this bold but potentially risky agenda focused on economic nationalism and changing how the government works. And then on the world stage, we've got a more assertive and unpredictable America, willing to flex its muscles to get what it wants.
Yeah, it's like the old rules don't apply anymore.
Exactly. We're in uncharted territory.
And I think that's what makes this whole deep dive so fascinating. We're not just looking at a list of policies. We're trying to make sense of a potential sea change. Like, how is America's role in the world changing? And how is its relationship with its own citizens changing?
It's a huge question.
Huge. And the sources only give us a small glimpse of what might be coming.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Immigration, border security, international relations, the economy, government reform, how the media is changing. It's almost too much to take in. All right, I need a minute to process all that.
Yeah, it's a lot to digest.
So much going on. What's the biggest takeaway for you from all this? What really sticks out?
I think it's this combination of ambition,
Yeah.
like huge ambition, with the potential for things to go really right or really wrong. Trump's not afraid to shake things up, whether it's the economy, immigration, how America deals with other countries. He goes big.
Yeah, he definitely doesn't shy away from a challenge. But this time, it feels like there's even more at stake. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh, for sure. The sources paint this picture of America kind of walking a tightrope. On one side, you've got this excitement from businesses, hopes for a booming economy, a renewed focus on keeping the country safe. But then on the other side,
There's that dark side.
exactly, the national debt could spiral out of control, there's a real chance of conflicts with other countries, and all these divisions within the U.S., they could get even worse.
It's like we're at a crossroads, and there are so many different paths we could take.
That's a great way to put it. And that's why it's so important to really pay attention, you know? This isn't the time to just sit back and watch. No matter what your political views are, we need to be informed, think critically, question what we're hearing, and be willing to talk about these things even when it's uncomfortable.
So, no burying our heads in the sand. But how do we even begin to untangle all this? It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all the information, all the different opinions.
That's where deep dives like this can be helpful. It's about taking a break from the constant news cycle and really digging into the issues, not just repeating talking points, but actually grappling with the complexity, understanding the nuances. And anyone can do that. You don't need to be an expert.
So it's about empowering ourselves to be informed citizens, not just passively absorbing whatever information we're being fed.
Exactly.
But amidst all this talk about policy and strategy, are we losing sight of the human impact? These aren't just abstract ideas, they affect real people's lives.
That's so important. It's easy to get caught up in the big picture, the political game. But we can't forget that these policies have real consequences for individuals, for families, for communities. Those stories matter.
We have to remember the human cost.
Yes. And the unintended consequences, the ripple effects that go far beyond Washington.
So even amidst all the political battles, a reminder to have some empathy.
Exactly. And that ties into what we were saying before about having constructive dialogue. It's not about winning arguments. It's about trying to understand where other people are coming from, finding common ground, and working towards solutions that benefit everyone.
And that requires us to be willing to listen, to truly hear each other, to challenge our own biases.
Absolutely. It's not easy, especially these days.
Yeah.
But it's crucial if we want to create a fairer and more just society.
Well said.
Ah.
Okay, as we wrap up, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from this? What's the most important question they should be asking themselves as we head into these next 4 years?
I think the big question is this. What does Make America Great Again really mean? Are we trying to go back to a past that might not even be possible? Or are we trying to build a future that's better for everyone? More inclusive, more sustainable, more just? And how do we balance those two visions?
Wow, that's a powerful question, and it's one we all need to think about as we watch how things unfold.
It goes beyond politics. It's about our values, what kind of country we want to live in, what kind of future we want for ourselves and for future generations.
And that's a conversation worth having. Well, a huge GE thank you to you, our expert, for walking us through this. It's been eye-opening, to say the least.
My pleasure. It's been a great discussion.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to check out the sources for yourselves, keep asking questions, and be part of shaping the future. Until next time.